welcome. Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights, here with Rich Klein. We're going to talk about Topps' 75 greatest cards list. I actually was a small part of developing that, and I had gotten an immediate quick email response from Josh Hall regarding the top 75 greatest cards. He says, I'm quoting him, how do educated men, because I think it was all men, there may be one woman on the call, but we had a big Zoom call hosted at Topps. Nat Turner was on it, I was on it. There's been a published list of who was on the Zoom to finalize the list. They said, how do educated men continue to recognize and give credibility to Barry Bonds, who tarnished himself, the game, the league, the record book, and humanity? Also, Paul Skenes has 2 good years, and we're going to put his card between immortals, Jackie Robinson and Nolan Ryan. How much time did we spend doing this list? Okay, I've got lots to talk about because, like I said, I was there.
I'm going to start by talking about a Beckett product. Okay. 300 greatest baseball cards.
Mike Payne.
Mike Payne did 90% of the work. You know who did the other 10% of the work on that book?
Probably you. I'm saying it was more than 10%, but still. Great writer, but and a true collector. And Mike was a true collector.
We would hash the list over and we went back and forth. And remember, this book's in 1997. And we're making decisions as to what modern cards to put in. We put in, I believe, a Jeter card, a Alex Rodriguez card, modern cards. We had to stay with more superstars, but we got things like a 57 Topps Don Zimmer in, because it was just a cool photo. Zimmer was the Yankee first base coach. He was in the news at the time. He was the coach with the Yankees sitting next to Joe Torre. But we were also cognizant we had to have some modern cards in. So when it comes to Paul Skenes, 30 years ago, we were cognizant of having the 90s cards come into a book like that. Topps is cognizant that they have to have some representation of today's players in. Hopefully Skenes ends up with a Hall of Fame career, but I don't have a problem with a really modern card like Paul Skenes in a list like that. He and his girlfriend, Livy Dunn, who has gone to Fanatics Fest and buys cards, they are the examples of modern people. Skenes' debut game patch sold for $1 million. It is worth putting him in. And what happens to his career is another subject, but it's worth putting him in.
Okay, there's 75 on the list, and most of the publicity I've seen is about the top 10, which we were asked to rank the top 10, and we sent in our ballots, and they were mysteriously tabulated, and these are the top 10 in order they came up with. I certainly was in favor of Paul Skenes being on the list. I don't think I had him in my top 10, but he absolutely deserves it. And to Josh's point, Skenes didn't have 2 good years. He had 2 fabulous years. So he's off to a great start, whether he can continue it. Again, the same problem Mike Payne had and you had back in the day of how do you cover the span of collectors that would be appealing. But these 75 cards are going to be redemptions in the flagship baseball product. And you want to have some cards, not all vintage, even though it's heavy vintage over 75 years, with Topps being so only game in town for the first, whatever that was, 30 years practically. I was the one that pushed for more Ohtani and Judge, especially those 2 guys, especially Ohtani. But I don't think I wanted 5 of his cards to be in there, but I pushed really hard for one of his better cards.
As you should. Ohtani is a generational player. He is the first really successful 2-way player in years. And he's part of the huge Japanese market. Judge is a seminal figure in today's baseball. Fine to have these modern people. And that's why I pointed out what we did in the 90s. It's the same question in the 90s as it is in 2026, 30 years later.
Okay. One of the points I brought up on this huge Zoom call, maybe 20 people on the Zoom call, and all key individuals within Fanatics or within the world of baseball. Tim Kurkjian, terrific baseball writer, and Evan Longoria, who's also a collector. So everybody had a voice. But one of my points was, if this is a redemption card and you've got 75 of them, I wouldn't want a card in there that somebody would be disappointed to get. In other words, they shouldn't be commons. There should be a thrill that I got one of the redemption cards. And I pushed back a little bit and more than a little bit, about the Aurelio Rodriguez, the Bat Boy card.
Yeah, I can see why. When we were active buying and selling in the 70s, that was a huge thing.
That was the thing. And that's what they were remembering. On the other hand, I was in the unenviable position on this call to have to represent the thoughts from the grave of Cy Berger. When they were talking about something, and I said, Cy wouldn't like that. What? So I talked to Cy about some of those things. He would not be pleased if you take that off the list or if you don't move that up higher. And they got a chuckle out of that. But again, errors, and that particular error where Topps was fooled, maybe it's just their way of poking fun at themselves.
There's other errors too that are just as interesting, in my opinion. One of the greatest error cards of all time. There's a 2006 Topps Heritage card of, I forgot the player's name, but it was the wrong photo on the card. And they sent it to him. And on every signature he wrote, "That's not me." One of the greatest things of all time. He signs the card. It's his name. And he puts "That's not me" on the card.
That's a good point. I don't think they thought too much about Heritage. Heritage, to me, is a collector brand. It's not a flagship brand, even though I think it has great appeal to those people who are into that. But they were mainly looking at flagship kinds of things.
And they should for a flagship product. I agree with that. But I was just pointing out the guy, when they sent him the card for Heritage, wrote "That's not me," which was hilarious. I want to be able to read the names on the card. I think it was 2021 where you can't read the name on the front of the card and you can't read the number on the back. That's a bad combination. One or the other should be readable.
But maybe they're appealing to people with better eyes.
Anytime you have a list, there's always going to be disagreement. And I still think Topps could have gone back one more time and done the buybacks and the stamps and all that on the cards, which they do in Heritage.
But Rich, they could have done that, but that's not the way the hobby is moving. The hobby is moving toward hits. And
Yes.
getting a rediscovered Topps card of a common player from the 90s is not considered a hit. You and I find those, they're sitting in the dollar boxes. Then
I'm thrilled. To me, that's a big hit.
I know, but if it's an unknown player, I'm just saying that's not what the modern hobby is looking for.
No, that's true.
And so the more inclusive thing, again, I thought that was great when they did that, but again, I'm not typical. One other thing that was really interesting, the final, because there were a bunch of emails and rankings in advance of this final Zoom call that we had, which turned out it was the week before Nat Turner bought my old company. And so on the Zoom, our squares were right next to each other, but we found ourselves, because he and I were two of the main collector centric, not the name of the company, but just representing the collector. And so we were agreeing on a whole bunch of things. Little did I know the next Monday he was buying our company. I'm sure he knew, but we were very in sync. And I said a lot of nice things about him, unbeknownst, and vice versa. So not a bromance, but I just was saying, you've got to move Rickey Henderson up on the list. And it's because he is so graded. They were saying, no, but we've got to put Griffey in there. I said, wait a minute, the most graded card is an upper deck Griffey, and you're not going to look good putting in a Topps rookie, quote unquote. When you say Griffey RC or rookie card, everybody's thinking 89 upper deck. It can be on the list, your first Griffey, but it shouldn't be in the top 10. And so that's why Rickey is totally in sync with Nat, because pop reports do matter in the modern hobby. If something is graded, that's another reason I was saying Ohtani and Judge. They're what people are sending in. That's truly a chase. And they'll be pleased if they get a 52 Jackie, or the guy that gets the Mickey Mantle is just going to be over the moon. But there's also some really good cards in there. I don't know what level of grading, of number grade, when they did the promotion back in the day, the cards weren't mint and they weren't super rough, but I think everything is going to be graded and delivered via the redemption process.
So we were talking about the buybacks. I stopped at a different wax store about a week before I bought the blaster box. I bought a couple. I was in the area, so I just wanted to stop in. And I bought a pack of 2025 Heritage, and I got a buyback in the pack. I was thinking, this is great. And it was a guy named Glenn Boardman. He was a common Twins catcher, so I should probably get it to Stefan. But he grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, which is about 15 minutes from where I grew up. In those days, players from New Jersey weren't very common, so I was laughing all the way. This had to be the most appropriate buyback card I could have gotten in 2025 Heritage. Not as good as Eckersley, but not bad. I get that you're right, that the world of buybacks has changed. I just wish they had done the one of everything, because the 52 high number set would have cost so much money. But those would be redemptions anyway. And who's going to turn down a card that in even terrible conditions, a $50 card? That's a pretty good hit in my book out of a pack.
The other thing that comes up, that we had a conversation on this, but with so many people, you couldn't have a long conversation about anything. But the tension in the hobby between popularity of the player and the performance of the player. To Josh's point, I don't think Barry Bonds has committed any crimes against humanity. He just took steroids. He took performance enhancing kinds of things. And I don't know that he got away with it as much as he just did it and nobody pulled his plug and he kept hitting home runs. He kept making solid contact. I don't think he's a terrible person. I think he was opportunistic. What laws did he break? Is he going to go to jail? The number of home runs he hit is the number of home runs he hit. Now, if you want to put an asterisk by that, I'm fine with that. But I do think eventually he's going to get in the Hall of Fame because his personality has worked against him. His performance is way up in the top 10. Now, I did not have his 86 Topps traded extended card in there, even if you include the Tiffany. I really would not have had him in the top 10. But again, the popularity and performance both relate. Neither one is a perfect correlation. For example, nobody was griping on the call that we would have the Nolan Ryan rookie up in the top 10, well into the top 10. And it wasn't because Jerry Koosman added some juice. It was that Nolan Ryan was just an amazing pitcher doing things that no other pitcher did. But his one-loss record wasn't that great. But nobody was talking about that. He stayed in the game. He's a credit to the game. So there was that.
I'm going to give you a small side note. This is just something I'm personally curious about and nothing else. You've met with the people from PSA. I don't know if you've heard this, but Ryan Hogue grew up in Plano. And when he comes to town, he stays at his parents' house. I wonder how long he's been in the hobby, if he ever came to one of my shows back in the day.
He could have. Yeah, that's possible.
Or he went to Cal show and I may have dealt with him and never known it.
I told you, Dallas is the epicenter of the hobby.
Yeah, I thought
I was stretching.
You were stretching, but you know what? In 2026,
yeah,
you're pretty darn close to Dallas-Fort Worth being the epicenter of the hobby. Yeah. You were just psychic.
That's like all those years in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. The Cubs are going to win the World Series. Sooner or later, your prediction can be right, but it may take 100 years. Last point about the top 75, and I don't think I was as vocal as I probably should have been on this, but I think it's come to pass, and that is that at one point on the call, there was discussion of what are the bottom 10 of the top 75. And I think that's a downer. If you have the top 75 cards that Topps has ever put out, now here are the numbers 66, 67, 68, all the way down to 75. So I was not in favor of that. And now they're mainly touting the top 10, which is a big deal. And there's some other great cards, but they were looking at the bottom 10. And I thought, that's the bottom 10 in order to move somebody up that we've overlooked. That's different. Just the soccer relegation where you come in last and you're going to get supplanted the next year. But I think this is a one shot. I think they'll do some other different things, but they could do artistic renditions of each of the 75 from various artists, like they've done with some chase elements in there. So Topps has gotten very creative. I applaud them for doing this and for getting industry insiders. I don't think they had a popular vote, but I felt I was underrepresented in terms of collectors in the hobby and maybe of the old guard, perhaps. And Nat Turner was there, but he's not typical either. So just the regular collectors would be nice to add that in as a component of the vote. That would have been good.
One thing about the bottom 10 of any list, and you discuss this whenever there's the football card Hall of Fame voting or the racing card Hall of Fame voting or the baseball card Hall of Fame voting, your bottom 10%, you can always find a 10% that might be better than your bottom 10% of your major league roster. Sometimes
it's like the Hall of Fame argument. Right. This guy to be in the Hall of Fame because he's better than this other mediocre Hall of Famer, which they're not mediocre, but they're just not the top guys. But it may engender a conversation, so maybe that's good. But still, these aren't scrubs. It's like the Hall of Fame. These top 75 cards are all really good cards.
Except Topps has smart people working for them. And I sit with a different local store owner every time he sets up at a Dallas card show, and we chat for usually about an hour. And we're chatting, and Sponge Pants Bob, or whatever that's called, had just come out. Those packs in those boxes were sky high, and they were selling incredibly well because Topps understood that's the generation of people who are buying today's cards. And you can love Fanatics, you can say they're terrible, but they got some really smart people working in the marketing and the planning department, knowing what's going to work for the people buying their products.
Clay Luraschi, our mutual friend, we've known for 30 plus years, since the 90s for sure. He's been with Topps, I think, for 25 years. He was not vocal on the call, and I was wondering about that, but I realized his fingerprints were on the derivation of the list. He's very knowledgeable, and he really cares about the hobby. So very quiet on the call, but I think he had been very instrumental in developing the list of 125 that we whittled down from.
Clay's fairly quiet unless you know him. He's one of these people that does amazing work in the background. And a little hobby hidden secret at the National, sometimes they'll ask you if Topps at the party to guess a price. One of the options is Ask Clay. Always take the Ask Clay. You will win 99.5% of the time that way.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks, Clay. Clay, you're my sushi buddy, and Topps, well done. And thank you, Josh, for your question. Barry Bonds, not a criminal. He broke some rules. And Paul Skenes might be a footnote. He might blow out his arm and be Brian Taylor or Todd Van Poppel. I don't think so, but
I'm still waiting for the Skenes done 1-of-1 signed dual card, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Rich.